Hello. So today we are talking with Professor Bridget Anderson. She's a professor of migration, mobilities, and citizenship at the University of Bristol. She's the director of migration mobilities at the University of Bristol as well. I'm Heath Cabot. I'm at the University of Pittsburgh and one of the co-editors of the special issue that we're talking about today. And Bridget's piece is entitled Methodological Denationalism, De-exceptionalizing Displacement, Re-exceptionalizing Citizenship. And I guess I'm just going to get started with the question of, what does it mean to re-exceptionalize citizenship?
Hi, Heath. So I suppose I was thinking that, firstly, the way that citizenship is taken for granted. I mean, statelessness tends to be sort of assumed as being really exceptional. And so I think we tend to assume that more or less everyone is a citizen. And then, so in that sense, it needs to be exceptionalized. I wanted to exceptionalize it, but it's also re-exceptionalizing because historically citizenship did used to be exceptional. It was a status for white, male, able-bodied, property-owning men, male men, yeah. Which was a kind of status that then sort of is a bit like, I don't know, thinking like a bag or something, you know, it sort of got extended over other people to include other people like women, like people, and people who don't own property. But it kind of, so I suppose by re-exceptionalizing citizenship, I wanted to suggest firstly that we shouldn't take it for granted, and also a way of reminding us of citizenship's past, which cast shadow, but also to suggest that maybe there are other ways of relating to each other socially and politically. So there's nothing set in stone about citizenship.
Right. Thank you. That's beautiful. And that's also just one thing that I wanted to sort of flag as part of the discussion that's come out of your piece is that, you know, I think the way you urge us not to just focus on the de-exceptionalizing displacement, but this dual move, right? We also have to remember this kind of the exceptional aspects of citizenship as well as its emergent qualities. The other sort of major term that I wanted to ask you to unpack a little bit for us, which I know you've written about elsewhere as well, which has a history, is this term methodological denationalism. What do you mean by that, and why is it so important to your paper?
How long have you got? So methodological denationalism is a kind of riff off methodological nationalism. So for most people who won't know about methodological nationalism, this is a kind of problem that has been identified for not just for the study of migration and movement, but actually for social sciences more generally, which is the assumption that the nation state is a kind of container of social processes, and that the nation state is also kind of equivalent to society, so that when we're talking in society, people behave like this, we're kind of assuming that that society is equivalent to a nation state. And so what that does is that it predefines and determines certain objects of sociological inquiry, and it also means that we ignore certain other objects of inquiry, and most particularly the work that this kind of container of nation state is doing. So, and in a way, that's also part of how nation states are made. So, and this is particularly important when it comes to migration, because I would argue that it's one of the ways in which people who move are turned into migrants, because obviously people have always moved and continue to move, but only certain kinds of movement are termed migration, and certain kinds of people are termed migrants. And one of the key factors in that is whether they move from one assumed kind of social container to another social container. So that's methodological nationalism. The methodological denationalism kind of really tries to turn that on its head, and more particularly when thinking about migration, it basically treats immigration and citizenship regimes as productive. So it's not that these are taps that, you know, so I think people quite often think about immigration laws as taps which sort of switch on the flow of migrants across a border, putting it crudely. But this kind of methodological denationalism sees immigration and citizenship laws as actually making migrants and making citizens rather than distinguishing already pre-existing groups. But on the other hand, you know, just saying, oh, nobody's really a migrant, nobody's really a citizen, all constructed, you know, that you can't, that's kind of also a certain kind of magical thinking. So also tries to, so I would say that, you know, if you're thinking methodologically in a methodologically denationalist way, you're kind of recognizing that actually these state-imposed categories of migrant and citizen really do matter. They have effects in the real world. They're not just sort of fantasies. And they, among their effects are the production of nationalized subjectivities, which means that, by which I mean, that, you know, the ways in which generally we imagine our place in the world is in part shaped by assumptions of methodological nationalism. And again, that has real consequences for the ways that we imagine ourselves and our social relationships. So it's kind of trying to see this as something that is in the making, that we are making, but that can be otherwise.
Thank you so much. And this, I think, leads directly into my next question, which has to do with the sort of empirical aspects of your chapter, article, excuse me, which really focuses on the Windrush scandal. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about why this is such a powerful case to think through or enact some of what you've just been talking about, right? Sort of methodological denationalism, but also what makes it, so tell us more about how that allows us to do the different kinds of things we're trying to do in this special issue.
Yeah, so the Windrush scandal, for people who don't know, was basically a scandal that emerged when it became plain that numbers of British citizens or people with long-term residence rights in the UK had been evicted, denied medical treatment, lost their jobs, and in some cases even deported because they couldn't prove their citizenship. And it was called the Windrush scandal because many of the cases that emerged were from a generation of Caribbean migrants who came to the UK after World War II, and who are kind of almost like quite an iconic group of people. You know, they're almost like they're the good migrants. You know, they figure in a lot of, they're part of the sort of cultural repertoire, I suppose, of British soap operas and TV and so on. So, you know, it was considered particularly bad that this group of people who are these cultural icons were treated so appallingly. Though I do think it's kind of worth noting that, you know, it was not only these people. And this scandal, which emerged a couple of years ago, has actually been ongoing because my mum actually couldn't get her pension. This was going back into the 90s because she couldn't find her naturalization certificate. So I kind of think it's something that has been occurring for quite a long time.
Wow.
So that was the kind of that was the facts of the matter in a nutshell. So this is about de-exceptionalizing displacement, I think, because it helps us see, firstly, that, and this is something I know that recurs throughout the special issue, but I do think it's worth kind of noting that because the terminology of displacement is so strongly associated in the field of migration and forced migration studies with the global south, And so, you know, it shows us that this is not exceptional. It is not, displacement is not confined to the global south. It also tells us that displacement can be linked to deportation, because many of these people were deported. And it's de-exceptional because actually there was nothing exceptional about this group of people, apart from their blackness. And that there was, and they were part of a very kind of banal enforcement of immigration controls. So on the one hand, it's de-exceptionalizing, but it also exceptionalizes citizenship, because I think it shows, you know, getting back to thinking about the history of citizenship, that in the UK, citizenship is still imagined as white, and that it is viewed as a privilege. That it, you know, so when the scandal emerged, you know, there was horror. Everyone sort of, the government threw their hands up and apologized, because these were good citizens, as they kept, you know, these were midwives, these were who'd worked hard all their lives. So these were people who actually, you know, deserved to be in England, obviously overlooking history of colonization and Britain's role in slavery and in the colonization of the Caribbean.
If I may, just real quick, like I also think something that when I was looking over your article again today, I was sort of thinking about the way you talk about the Windrush scandal in conjunction with thinking about homelessness as well, more broadly. And I think the article really invites us to think about the, again, unexceptional ways in which race and also class get sort of embedded into imaginaries of who belongs and who shouldn't. And I think there's a really nice quote that I just wanted to read, like, the racialization of migrant entails the racialization of citizen, and as citizenship is nationalized in law, so it becomes racialized in practice. And to me, that sort of invites us back to what you were talking about, is the different ways in which methodological nationalism, I mean, that, or just nationalism, let's say, right, finds its way into places that one may not be aware of. And that's why I think this kind of critical look that you're giving us is so important. Anyway, but I do have a follow-up question, and you know, as a US person, without this kind of cultural history, although we are watching Call the Midwife lately. there's a Windrush person in there, I think, very much a good migrant.
Yeah.
But without that sort of that cultural knowledge, I'm wondering what some of the takeaways, for instance, I mean, to what extent is this case specific to the UK or a post-colonial, let's say, metropole? And to what extent does it actually invite us to take your analysis into other places? For instance, like I work in Greece. I mean, what are things that we might take that are broader, let's say, about this specific empirical context?
Well, I think you've just stolen my thunder by that previous quotation, actually, because I think there is something here about nationalism, and I think that while you know, while obviously Britain was a colonial power, the nation state system has now been rolled out all over the world, and I would say that, you know, that rollout and the ways in which we imagine the world as sort of cut up now into territories with borders, each person with their own citizenship and their own emplacement and the place where they should be attached to a particular land. I mean, I think that has, you know, that has traction all over the world, and not only in kind of colonial metropoles and former colonies. That's kind of how we now understand the globe. And our social and political relations. And I think it's also sort of important here to think about, so I use the word nation state, and I think I'd just like to kind of draw attention to that, because I think whenever I'm talking to my students, you know, I always kind of try and get them to pull apart the nation and the state, and to think about the relevance of the nation as well as the state, and more particularly the relation between nation and race or ethnicity, which I saw exposed very, very much in the Windrush case. So, you know, so people kind of, so people's belonging or not, or their out of placeness is read very often off their ethnicity or their race. And I think that then there's also a kind of really interesting ambivalence of the term nationality. So I think it's sort of interesting to think about the role that nationality plays here, because nationality, belonging to the nation, is a synonym of citizenship, but it also signifies belonging to the nation. And I think that kind of strategic ambiguity actually is quite important, because it also connects, it sort of ties nationality to ideas of ancestry, and in the same way that citizenship is tied to ideas of ancestry, but also through that race. So, and I think that kind of stretches beyond, you know, beyond the particularities of the Windrush case, and indeed beyond the particularities of the UK.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So you're somebody whose work, to be honest, I mean, you've been doing this kind of, you've been troubling these binaries, migrant citizenship. You've been asking us to look critically at the framework of citizenship for a long time. And so in this sense, I think that you're one of the spiritual, let's say, or intellectual inspirations for why we ended up wanting to do this special issue anyway. And so we wanted to ask you, or I wanted to ask you, whether there's been whether this has all been kind of renewing or just well-trodden terrain, let's say, over work you've already done, or whether there have been new insights you've gained through, or emergent insights you've gained through working on a special issue with us.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very nice to say. No, I learned so much. I mean, goodness, where do I start? And I also learned a lot from actually from the interviews that we've been doing with each other, because so I think it also, I think that the process of methodological denationalizing our ways of thinking, I mean, that's just something that I think, you know, personally, I feel like I've got to work at all the time. So there's always kind of more and more to learn. And I think, you know, so I feel like, well, I've learned a lot, both factually, historically, you know, about how this works, about, you know, the difference between settler colonial states, for example, and a country like the UK. I think there's something really important to be done about the temporalities of displacement, and, you know, the really interesting connections and distinctions that particularly you and Georgina make around sort of precarity and displacement. I think perhaps more than anything, there's something about the existential quality of displacement that I think so many of the papers, in a way, for me, that was one of the kind of common threads as I was reading the papers that kept kind of coming out at me. And it was an existential quality that you feel is something that is shared, and that is, it's both kind of general and particular. So you feel like, oh, you know, on the one hand, the trouble potentially with displacement is it just like can end up meaning everyone. So then its value as a kind of analytical force sort of falls away, because, well, if everyone's displaced, then what's the point of saying that? Totally. What's the point of talking about displacement?
Totally.
What you see is that the kind of the particularities of displacement and how that's experienced in the lives both of individuals, you know, of homeless people, for example, and of refugees, they're very different. And yet there is this kind of existential, there are these commonalities, and these commonalities are both kind of, you know, you can trace them historically, and you can also trace them kind of emotionally. Like there's lots of there's lots of different ways in which they can come together. And it's almost like they come together and then they part, you know, so it's, well, so when do you capture the moment when they come together? That, you know, so I think Heike's piece does this beautifully, you know, when you capture them, those moments when they come together is really important, you know, that is a political leverage, but then you have to let them part again. So I think there's something, yes, both, what's the word, both substantial and evanescent about it that I really illuminating.
Thank you. That was really helpful for me to hear you unpack that, and also it's just also sort of referencing, if I may, that aspect of both tracking them as they come together, but being disciplined about letting them fall apart is so important, because, you know, we don't want to turn this into another basket, you know, to just throw things into, or, you know, or talk. It's not comparison, right? It's not something, it's not presuming equivalence. There's this sort of, and that's where I think, going back to that empirical level where you're looking at specific things, or each paper is sort of embedded in its own context, it's how to track those things, how to actually enact that methodological denationalism is part of the challenge, right? Anyway, thank you. I guess my final question kind of goes back to what we talked about during our interview, and this was sort of thinking about COVID-19, right? And like, which I know that you didn't end up writing into your paper, but you've written about recently as well. And I'm just wondering how, if we talk about shared experiences, how has this experience over the last year shifted or reinforced your ideas of what constitutes mobility, displacement, emplacement? How has this changed how you approach these kinds of questions and issues?
Yeah. Well, I suppose what's interesting, I think, is not so much what it's done for me, but I think probably what it's done for kind of other people, like just living their lives. And I think there's lots of ways in which it's been interesting. So I remember when lockdown first happened, thinking about time. So getting back to this question of temporalities of displacement, and how, you know, we didn't know how long it was going to go on for. God, if we'd have known, we'd still be here. But like, and there was something about living in this permanently unfolding present that was really, you know, made me think about the temporalities of waiting and migration. You know, again, importantly, not to say that this is equivalent, but, you know, can this help us understand the feeling of what it is like to not be able to imagine the future with you in it, to not have that kind of picture. So I think there was something about temporality. There was also interesting things about borders, I think, and the ways in which, I mean, I don't know what it was like in the US, but in the UK, we saw all sorts of borders that actually, for most of us, had been completely invisible inside the country. So we were divided into different tiers, and in some places shops were open, and in others, you know, you could get your hair cut. And that actually depended on local authority boundaries that actually, you notice if you're on welfare benefits, or you know, or if you're on remand from prison, but actually for most people, most of the time you don't notice it. So I think suddenly you saw these administrative boundaries that were really surprising. So I think those kind of were very striking, and so you became more aware of displacement and emplacement in a different scale. I think that you did also have a different sense of scale. So suddenly, you know, everyone has sort of remarked on this, you know, the growth of Zoom, and, you know, and actually I talked to much more people on Zoom. You know, it was funny, the people I kept in touch with on Zoom, they weren't like necessarily my best mates. It's just something happened to scale, so that things were no longer nested in each other. Everything felt much more networked. And I think that perhaps suggests something is happening with displacement and emplacement, because displacement and emplacement has a certain inbuilt kind of idea of scale. I think thinking about networks, that sort of shakes that up. So I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, but I think there is a kind of change, I think.
That's really interesting. Networks. And also I've heard someone talk about thickening, right? Like the thickening of networks or thickening of social fields happening around these kind of communications we're engaging with as well. Anyway, so thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I could keep asking you questions, but I should probably let you off the hook. Thank you so much, Bridget, for your time and for your wonderful interventions and participation in the project. It's been so great.
Thank you, Heath, and thank you, and Georgina, for your great editing and for pulling it all together. Well done.